Thank you, Amanda. How's this sound? Great. Yeah, so I'm really disappointed that Matt Fontaine was unable to join us. He had something come up yesterday. It was an emergency. He asked me to cut his slides, but I'm still going to use some because it was really good stuff. So if you know Matt or don't know Matt, go seek him out. He has really good content and is also very great resume in stormwater parks and really good insights. So I'm going to try to share some of what he's got there too. And thankful to Christian for stepping in as our relief pitcher here to cover some of Matt's slides as well. So we did title this Stormwater Parks Everywhere. It's like, let's look at where it's been done elsewhere. The other thing that we wanted to get across, and I don't think we have a slide for it, is even before we came up with this term of stormwater parks, good regional stormwater design was integrating many of those same principles into it. The idea of creating stormwater spaces that benefit the community is kind of really where we all want to go. And so there's really good examples that may not have been at the time a stormwater park branding, but it's really exciting to see that we've been doing some really good work over the years. So we are going to cover why stormwater parks. I'm going to cover a bit of what are stormwater parks, and maybe that's something, if we have time at the end, we can have more discussion about. So kind of think about that as we are starting to kind of really build this as a practice. Maybe there's a chance for us to kind of talk about what is that terminology and how do we define what is a stormwater park and what is good. And then, we're just going to pop around to some regional and national examples. Not all of them are even Herrera or Jacobs projects. I'm a fan of stormwater management, so we geek out. And if I see a good project, I'm going to feature it here. So, but it's also not every project. So why stormwater parks? These are Matt's slides, so I'll hopefully do them justice. But, we've been dealing with stormwater issues for many years throughout the Puget Sound area. This is a cartoon. I think it was the Seattle Times back in the days. I think of when Lake Washington was like actually labeled as a cesspool. Right? So it was like really poor water quality. We found that our combined sewer systems were just dumping into our waters. And it was a huge problem, right? People did not want to come to the beaches. We even had signs, right? Like, don't swim here. Don't use this space. I mean, it's just like our management of water was actually reducing the ability for the community to interact with water because we were creating these toxic places that were not safe for people or ecology to really thrive. But we've solved it to some extent, right? We addressed that big issue. The West Point treatment plant and this building these wastewater treatment facilities helped address that, and Lake Washington recovered. Now, many people do swim in Lake Washington. Not saying it's perfect, because we'll get into some of that. There's some other issues as we continue to evolve our science. We realize other things that we as humans are doing to damage our water resources, but there are ways that we can do big things, and we can make some corrections to our past mistakes. I believe these are Matt's kids, but I think this point here is really, this is what we want to do. This is why we're doing the work that we're doing, is for our families, for our community, for us to be able to enjoy these resources and be part of the environment. I know Matt is a huge fisherman, and he's very, very invested in this, right? His fishing love and his love of being out there is really involved in that, and I think it's important. And I love hearing him talk about it because it's a space that's really important. But we see here, we're going to talk a lot about the other track here about 6 ppdq. We are creating severe impacts on our environment, and this is just an example of the pre-spawn mortality issue that has kind of plagued many of our urban streams throughout. And obviously it's the food chain, right? Sometimes it's helpful. I get kind of curious when I look at other regions across the country or the world. There's always kind of like, maybe it's a mascot or something that's like that thing that everybody cares about, right? And many of us are getting behind. So many of our public, regardless of where you are, cares about the orca, right? But it's the entire ecosystem that we're really trying to do to protect that key species. So just understanding that it's what we do affects the entire food chain and affects our entire ecology. So I don't have all the details on this one. Is Carly Grail in the room? Okay, you're right there. Sorry, Carly, but I'll tell you, Matt was going to cover the WICB project because what he really wanted to cover, this is an effort by King County and all these great partners that worked for them to develop basically a water quality benefits evaluation, to look at what are some of the best, and Carly can give much better rules for this, so find Carly later. But a lot of really great planning and modeling to see what are the biggest ways we can make an impact on the water quality in King County. And one of the key findings of that was regional facilities are a way to really get some of the biggest impact. So they looked at all these different programs, all these different interventions we could do for stormwater, and they all do some good. But the one that really did the heavy lifting was these regional facilities. Looking at some of the examples you might see, that are the Manchester Stormwater Park, Point Defiance, all these, finding that when we can scale up and build a space that can regionally manage and treat stormwater and meet community needs, there's value across the board. It's saving money, but it's also adding more value to our communities. So there's really great work and modeling that goes behind it that really shows the math behind it. But it's one of those ways that really can invest. And one of the key outcomes of that I think is really inspiring is the goal to have 30 stormwater parks in King County built in 30 years. So there's a challenge to everybody out there, right? Let's go do this. So what are stormwater parks? Well, before we get into that, I kind of like this slide. It's one we developed, but this is kind of a slide that kind of walks through my own history in stormwater management and the time before me. We're all kind of aware that early on in stormwater management, the goal was more drainage, right? Get the water out and away. We want to live in dry spaces, leave roads dry for the roads. And then we realized kind of the 80s, 90s, we started adding stormwater code to add treatment and storage to that so we don't affect our neighbors. That was great. My career began when everybody was realizing we're still really affecting the hydrology of our systems. We need to do low impact development, treat water at the source, do ways that mimic natural hydrology. And that's evolved over the last 20 so years to improve that, to increase more and more nature-based systems. And now I believe we're in a space, this new paradigm that I call green infrastructure plus. Our local agencies are trying to use green infrastructure and stormwater management, see the opportunity to not just manage stormwater, but to improve communities, to improve equity and resilience, to address disadvantaged communities that are most impacted by water and drainage issues, because that's historically where people have done that. And that's really, I think, where stormwater parks comes in. We have the ability to do more with stormwater management when we work with partners and create these spaces that manage stormwater, but also improve our communities. So, and maybe we can have some discussion around this. One of the things as we were planning for this was, what is the definition of a stormwater park? And there's a couple that are out there, right? Erica Harris is here. She'll be presenting a little bit later on, but Puget Sound Regional Council has this definition in their literature. But really the key here is managing stormwater and benefiting communities and creating recreational spaces. FEMA also uses the term stormwater parks, but they actually up the scale a little bit. They talk about communities in this definition, and they talk about water quality, but also they talk about extreme events, because that is really where green infrastructure has come up short in historical ways. It's meant to manage the smaller storms and the hydrology. And it's a very key part of our toolbox. But at times, we need extra storage. We need extra space to provide that water quality and as well as having space. But we don't need that all of the time, right? So can we design stormwater facilities and parks that share the space, maybe temporarily or even physically? And I'm going to go into a couple of different examples as we go through there. But if you have the need for storage during extreme events, those are often times when people aren't gathering those spaces. So can you design it so that you're making it accessible and beneficial for all of those dry periods where it's not being full of water? So we went through an effort. We were also in King County and Seattle Public Utilities Green Infrastructure Program. And in, I forget what year it was, but the King County the mayor's office set a goal to manage 700 million gallons by the year 2025. So that's a core aspect of this program, is meeting and achieving that goals. SBU asked the question, well, how are our ponds doing? Can we count our ponds as green infrastructure? And so we went back over the definition of green infrastructure and said, well, what does that mean? And so the first thing we said was, well, the original definition that's currently in their plan was that stormwater management practices that mimic natural systems and provide multiple benefits. All we found that all we needed to do to be able to take credit for stormwater ponds is remove that word distributed. Because when we're talking about stormwater ponds, or stormwater parks, we're talking about more regional solutions. They're sometimes more concentrated, but that's not necessarily the only way to address the issues. And then what we found was really at the core of this definition is a two-part test. Is there some function that we're providing stormwater that's mimicking natural hydrology? And that could be through water quality, it could be through flow control, infiltration, reuse, or even mimicking floodplains. So we looked at all the ponds and said, okay, are they doing some function that's doing more than just that's typical sturge pond, but doing more of a mimicking of natural functions. And the second part, which I think is really important, is it providing community benefit. And that benefit can range from, public access for recreation, whether it's active or passive. Is it also just being a visual amenity, or an amenity that the ecosystem can enjoy, and we're, again, supporting kind of urban ecosystems through this. And so we went through all of Seattle's ponds and basically categorized them and said some of these are actually green infrastructure because they are providing these additional benefits. And I think that kind of ties into these definitions of stormwater parks. I think another thing I want to get across is a big trend now for blue-green infrastructure. Who has all heard of blue infrastructure? Yeah, it's about half of us or so, whatnot, but I think that's also where stormwater parks fit into. It's a very specific type of green-blue infrastructure. Green infrastructure being that traditional definition of those small storm, distributed vegetative systems that mimic natural hydrology. Blue infrastructure being those larger facilities that can handle larger or more extreme flood events and provide that active storage when it's needed. So blue-green infrastructure combines the best of both worlds. So green infrastructure practices that are barrier retention, permeable pavements, vegetated roofs, with more blue infrastructure that is larger ponds and surface areas where we can store water temporarily for extreme events. And when we had combined them together, we can get everything we want from stormwater to some extent, right? We can get water quality treatment, we can get resiliency, we can build systems that are adaptive, and we can enhance the community. And a term that's been used, that we're doing some work in New Orleans, is living with water. It's changing our paradigm from that drainage one that I talked about, where we're just giving the water away from us, but learning how water is a resource and it's something we live with, and extreme events do happen, but we can build our infrastructure so we're sharing that space instead of putting, when I started my career, we were building ponds that had fences around them, like stormwater prisons. I didn't want to build more stormwater prisons that keep people out. We want to invite people in a safe manner. So I love this slide because it's like, when we say living with water, are we doing this, which is like, I think the New York storm during Hurricane Sandy, like where we used to have water coming into our spaces and causing issues? Or are we really trying to live with water in a celebrated fashion, in a way that allows us to interact with that water and have it be an enhancement to our communities? Obviously, we're trying to do the one on the right. So a couple ways to kind of frame this discussion, and there's so many other ways to go about this, but when I'm thinking about stormwater park design, I'm thinking we're really talking about that balance and integration of the community needs with the stormwater needs. So this kind of graphic is just conceptual around that, but as we think about what we're trying to achieve for stormwater management objectives, when we're doing water quality, we often need a small footprint to address water quality. As we add in more stormwater functions, we need a larger footprint. So if we go for infiltration or reuse, we need a little more space. When we go for trying to address localized flooding, a little bit more space. When trying to address regional flooding, oftentimes that takes a lot of volume of water. So we need more space. But we think about the community needs, that can be very variable. The community might be really in need of active space that they can use, and it's a little bit harder to share that area with stormwater. Or it could be more passive uses to where it's more of a natural system that people just need access to green space. So a really core aspect of that is exploring what are your true stormwater management objectives and what are your community objectives? And how can you find ways to overlap those either physically or in time, right? So it's whether you can use them recreational space during dry periods and flooding during wet periods, or do you layer them? And that gets to this next point. Another way that I've kind of looked at some of these stormwater parks is what are we doing with the stormwater? Are we hiding it in some way so that you can use more of that space for community uses? Are you celebrating the stormwater function? And I would argue that in the stormwater park, you could do either. It's really a matter of how is it sharing the space with the community needs. There's another scale that I haven't figured out how to put into this, is maybe disguised stormwater function. When you initially look at it, it's just part of that community, that park space, but is actually serving a stormwater function. And I'll show a couple of examples of how that's done. Another way I kind of looked at some of these projects that are regionally and nationally is kind of plot them on the scale, kind of wrapping this up a little bit is, are they providing water quality? Or are they providing flow control? And again, that kind of affects the footprint of what you need for the stormwater management piece. And the other scale is the recreational function more passive? Or is it more active, like sports fields and areas where really people need to be out there active? And you can see so many of this cover the entire spectrum. And it really comes down to that thoughtful design of working with the community about what it needs and really understanding your watershed and what is that function that you're trying to achieve with the stormwater. Whew. I don't know how we're doing on time, but we're great. So this is my chance to bring in our pitch hitter, Christian, to talk a little bit of one of the great examples that Matt was going to feature.
Thank you, Dustin. I'm happy to be back at this conference. I was here a couple years ago presenting sort of a midway point on the watershed assessment that we did on Bainbridge Island. So now I get to come back and talk about sort of the results and the final product out of that watershed assessment that many people, or a few people in this room, helped make happen. We have Geotech here, Jenny and Derek helped fund it. So we got all the players here to help support me. So we're talking about the stormwater park design that's currently planned for the Bainbridge Island Native Food Forest, which is a city-owned parcel on Bainbridge Island that was donated by the previous landowner as part of an open space project and a agricultural land protection project. So this couple of parcels here was a Christmas tree farm for many years. I think, pretty sure we bought Christmas trees there when I was little. And the family didn't want to manage it anymore and donated it. But they put some conservation easements on the deed before they gave it to us that said it couldn't be used for commercial agriculture. So our local nonprofit on the island that manages these types of properties called Friends of the Farms spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was the best use of this property. They decided that a native food forest concept, community orchard with other native plants that humans like to use should be incorporated into a long-term vision. But the other interesting point about this parcel is that in its agricultural history, there was a large ditch dug on the uphill slope of it that actually extended far north and caught all the runoff from a large neighborhood and elementary school above the agricultural lands and concentrated all that water. Like Dustin was saying, we used to just convey it and take it to the stream as fast as we could. So we knew there was a opportunity there to take that concentrated flow and try to put it back into the ground or meter it out in a more natural fashion. So going back sort of to the watershed assessment, the state and King County, through a couple different projects, helped us identify this watershed as a high priority project for restoration, or area of the island for restoration. Also through the stream flow restoration planning process, this area was identified as having high stress for future permit exempt wells. So there's a lot of reasons why we focused on this area of the island to help design a project that could really mitigate and restore some of those practices. And we wanted to figure out how it could fit into this food forest master plan that was already in play for the property. So we took that into account as we were going through the design process. So this is looking southeast from a drone shot looking at the parcel. We picked out this previously cleared area to help avoid removal of significant tree stands. There will be a few trees that need to come out, but most of it will be fit into an area that's mostly Himalayan blackberry at the moment. They mow it every couple of years to keep it in check, but it's a previously disturbed site. So we created this naturalistic design on the right there that really kind of fit between the existing trees and just tucked it into the landscape a little bit better. And then the landscape architects at Herrera spent quite a bit of time back and forth with me and Friends of the Farms and the Bainbridge Island Land Trust to pick out a plant palette that would give lots of visual appeal to the human users of the park, as well as all the other non-human users that would like to call this area home if we gave them some better habitat. And that's me. I give it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Okay, so now I'm just gonna also just kind of walk through a bunch of projects that we've kind of highlighted as stormwater parks. And there's a little bit of a challenge here because some of them, I'm challenging all of you. You might think, is that really a stormwater park? But let's have that discussion, right? Because it's really about these spaces and how do we balance those needs? So the first one is the Los Angeles area. Los Angeles is doing a lot of stormwater parks as well. One of the main objectives in Los Angeles is trying to get water independence. They're trying to do as much as they can to capture stormwater, infiltrate, and recharge it into their aquifers. So they've been doing some stormwater parks and they're doing more and more of them under an increased funding package. But this is Sun Valley in Sun Valley, California. I believe this was already an existing recreational center and playfields. But in order to integrate stormwater into it, they built kind of around the periphery some rain gardens to treat the water and provide some ways to express it. But a lot of the heavy work of this facility is a subsurface vault and infiltration gallery underneath those playfields. And so this is one in upper right. I've kind of categorized some of those on those scales I talked about before, which is that stormwater function more hidden or celebrated? And again, are we trying to achieve flow control or active? In this case, the pressure point was we really need a lot of space for active recreation. It's hard to put a rain garden in the middle of a baseball field. I don't think our kids want to see that, but you can still do stormwater management. You can still do it in a way that mimics natural hydrology if you have the right soils or you find some other uses for that water to recycle that. And I think in this one also, there is a pump in that system and they're reusing that water for irrigation throughout the park. Next one's also in Los Angeles, but it's kind of flipping the script on the other side of the paradigm. This was the Dominguez Gap wetlands, basically converting one of those old channelized, you see it all the time through the LA River, concrete rivers. Well, restoring those back to nature. So this was, we basically restored one of those into a wetland facility that also provides flood control. And again, I consider this to be somewhat of a stormwater park because we're inviting people into it. We're building a trail. So it's more of a passive recreation, but providing flood control. And it is celebrated because you're inviting people in to experience that restored natural system. This is one in Philadelphia. My colleague Matt Dalrymple worked on. He was with Philadelphia Water Department. But this was a vacant lot. So Philadelphia is doing a lot of green infrastructure for their CSO reduction program. So they're looking at everywhere they have open space in the city of Philadelphia and seeing, can we do green infrastructure? Well, the community had basically adopted this vacant parcel. They were meeting there for community meetings and having barbecues and getting together. And so as part of this design, you don't want to take away that space from the community. In fact, they wanted to enhance this space. So again, this is the case where a little bit of the stormwater function is expressed at the surface through bioretention, but a lot of the storage is being provided subsurface through the use of structural soil cells and bioretention soil. So again, it's that case of understand what the community wants and needs, and how do you integrate that into your stormwater design? We have a very vast toolbox of ways we can blend the uses. This is from Washington, D.C. area. Washington, D.C. came out with a stormwater competition, said, hey, we want to do green infrastructure. Where should we do it? And our team was successful in winning the competition because we looked around at the streetscape of Washington, D.C., and it's very legendary for its radial pattern, right? It's got streets that are in a more radial pattern. So it leaves a lot of these triangle intersections that aren't really used very well. So we proposed and they funded to build stormwater parks in these triangles. It's another case where the stormwater is actually celebrated and we're inviting the community in and play spaces to really playfully celebrate that function. You can see here we got a, raindrops, hopscotch little pathway there, and we've got benches around the water features so people can experience that space. This is not a Jacobs project. Our colleague was the city project manager in the city of Atlanta. So I want to give credit where credit's due. This is HDR and Dropin and the Trust for Public Lands. But Atlanta's doing some really cool, large-scale stormwater parks, and it's well worth featuring. This is Rodney Cook Park. It's near the Mercedes-Benz, the new stadium there, but it's also a historically underserved community. In this area was residences that had been there for many, many years that frequently flooded because lo and behold, this is where there used to be a creek. And they piped it years ago to enable that development, and it floods. And this is unfortunately where more of the poorer communities would invest. And so they were very deliberate in Atlanta in engaging the community of what do we want to do here? You know, these are areas that are chronically flooding, and they ended up buying the property and building a park for the community and integrating stormwater into that. So this is the footprint of it. It's, as you can see, it's several blocks bit large. They worked with landscape architects in the community to kind of honor historic ideas for what this park could look like. And they basically built, in the center there, there's this permanent pool that is there as a community amenity for the park and providing water quality. But they intentionally designed this area to flood. So during normal periods, during the summer and all that time, it's this wet pool that's got pathways around it and some amphitheaters. But through the modeling, you know, you can see during a 2-year storm, not much impact on park use. It's just filling up a little more of that surge area, filling the fringes and filling that up. During a 25-year, it starts to flood a few of the pathways interior to the park, but still much of the park is accessible for the public to use. And then during the 100-year event, it's allowed to flood even further. And this area that's an extra lobe there, and I've seen in plan view, is actually like a grass amphitheater, which, you know, during a 25-year storm, people aren't using that space. But the rest of the time, it could be a really great community space. So this is, again, back in plan view. And again, you can see that there's the permanent pool, but in the dashed red line there is how much is flooded during a 100-year event. So again, an example of sharing that space temporarily so that you can create a community amenity while also managing stormwater. And this is the built facility from perspective. And there's a really cool, thoughtful things they did in this project. I mean, they've got the kind of walkways and boardwalks that go out over the wetland area so people can really interact with it and see and look down upon it and see the wildlife that's thriving there now. Also for safety, but also as an amenity, that fringe area is a denser wetland to discourage people and children and people from going into the water, but you don't need to do that with a chain link fence. You can do this, there's really cool features in your landscape architecture design to make sure that you're discouraging that space and educating people that this is a stormwater facility. One of my last national examples, this is a plan we did for Miami Beach, the blue-green infrastructure plan. So throughout that entire plan, we looked at the entire city and said, what are areas we can do blue-green infrastructure? And one of the ideas I want to highlight here is they have an old public golf course in the middle of the city that is no longer economically as viable as it used to be. So people are going to other golf courses in Southern Florida. But the idea here is we actually looked at different scales of stormwater interventions. The first one, the lowest level, is just keep the golf course there, but let's take all those water features and make them manage stormwater. So allow them to fill up more, allow them to have better function for stormwater quality. The middle idea is let's keep a 9-hole golf course, but let's integrate the other half as natural systems, more passive recreation for the community, maybe put a few ball fields, but allows us to do more stormwater management to address the large coastal storms that happen there. And the last idea is really re-envision a space to think about the land use. So on the right-hand side, you probably can't see it because it's big room, big slide, whatever, but there's a whole lot of green infrastructure, blue infrastructure practices we can integrate throughout this park space to meet the stormwater function and enhance the community. So moving into some international examples, because we have some really great ones. Obviously, this is not a Jacobs project, but a lot of us get our inspiration from Copenhagen and the Netherlands and areas like that that have been managing and living with water for many years. This one's an interesting one. This is Bentham Square in Rotterdam. What I think is interesting and worth highlighting here is this is like a public plaza. It's an area where we're having people gather and it's a hardscape surface, but they allow it to flood. In some of those areas, they even have stairs leading into that flooded space are flooded areas. Now, from a legal perspective, in the States, we might have to think about that, right? Because oftentimes we're trying to put fences around those areas or saying we have a liability issue. But there are ways to do this thoughtfully. Another cool example, this was from the UK, United Kingdom. This is in Devon County, which I believe is the southeast coast of England. There's a really cool community called Sidmouth that had about 150 residences and businesses that would chronically flood. And in looking for solutions, there's just no space in that urban space right next to the flooded zones to be able to manage stormwater. But upstream, we found that we could divert flow into this natural area. Thing that finding when we're talking with the community, they had a large history of community theater. I think they had some ties to Shakespeare, things like that. So they'd have an annual Shakespeare festival and things like that. So the vision for this one was, let's create an amphitheater for these folks. Let's do an amphitheater, which is essentially a bowl, but that's going to function as a stormwater pond during large events. But other times it's a community space. So, you know, there's flow paths that lead people into it, tell people the story of how it's managing stormwater and managing the flooding impacts to the community. But again, during dry periods, you just have this really cool central amphitheater for people to be able to experience. Just a few more pictures of that, again, an aerial showing it and the community it's protecting. This during just immediately after construction and during construction. And again, we have bioretention soils in there. We have a very special feature going to get flooded. And I think this is my last example and slide here, but this is from Singapore. Singapore for many years has run what's called the Active Beautiful Clean program, ABC Waters program. Obviously, when I first did my first work on Singapore, I had to do the math. I was like, is this the metric system or is it just the intensity of storms? It's both, big numbers. But in order to do that, it's also one of the densest places in the world. So what they've done with their program is taken many of these old channels that flooded chronically, because again, they were over-engineered, more hardscaped, and they're restoring them to nature. And so this is they've gone down the Kalang River Basin and done some of these larger scale regional projects to build stormwater infrastructure. In this case, they've taken that channel and created a floodplain space that is also a park. So again, bigger scale, bigger population, but providing that community amenity as well. Oh, some more challenging ones. I'm returning back to Western Washington. City of Seattle's combined sewer overflow program. This is the Henderson project. It's in Stewart Park. There was existing tennis courts there. Now for CSO control, what we're doing is a lot of storage, right? This is where there's subsurface storage underneath the play courts. So you might say not a stormwater park, but yet again, it's really balancing the needs of the community. The community really wanted that active play space not to be impacted by this project. And so the team worked to basically build that storage underneath the tennis courts so that it's preserving that use for the community while still meeting that stormwater or combined sewer program, which I think combined sewer is a stormwater problem that way. Another one at another scale is King County's Georgetown Wet Weather Treatment Plant. This is a stormwater facility, right? It is a machine to treat stormwater, but it does not mean that it can't be an asset to the community. So in this case, there's a lot of green infrastructure integrated throughout that site, rain gardens, vegetated roofs and cisterns. And there's a lot of community education spaces that King County provided to the community so they have a place to gather and learn about what King County is. Because the community actually said, okay, you're doing this. We want to see it in action. We want to know what function this facility is doing. Don't hide it. Show us what it's doing. This might be my last one. So this is in City of Renton. This is the Sunset Terrace Regional Neighborhood Park. This is part of an overall planning effort for the Sunset area to revitalize it. Lots of community engagement to develop the community vision for this area. And what they said is they need a park. They need some assets to be able to connect a lot of these community assets because there's a senior center, there's a couple of elementary and the middle school, there's some other parks in that area, but they're all disconnected. And there's also a regional housing authority there. So the city developed a partnership with the King County Library System, Renton Housing Authority, a private developer to re-envision this area and do some land swapping to create this neighborhood park. And by doing that, we also, as a catalyst for that, the first thing that was built there was a regional stormwater facility, leveraging Department of Ecology grant funding to build a portion of that park first. And then that enabled City of Renton's parks to apply for funding to build the rest of the park around that. And this is an example where you're blending the design. We're kind of applying both techniques. So in front of the new library, this, oops, go back. Oops. In front of the library, we've expressed rain gardens to kind of create that passive recreation space where people can enjoy the nature that we've created there and understand the stormwater. But the rest of the stormwater function is provided by a subsurface infiltration facility that extends underneath those playgrounds. Because again, there's competing uses there. And I love this picture. This is from the website for the project, but it's really showing that function, right? On the left-hand side, those are the rain gardens. And the right-hand side, that's still a stormwater facility, but that's where the community is gathering for the ribbon cutting. And now there's a really cool play structure for the neighborhood kids to use there. That's on top of that stormwater facility. Oh, I do have one more. So this is one that's in development. It's 60% design right now, but working with a small group called the Friends of Arboretum Creek. They're neighborhood residences in the area of the Seattle Arboretum. And there's historical streams that were plumbed into the King County combined sewer system now, which is actually starving Arboretum Creek, which is a creek that runs through the Arboretum. Their goal has been, let's restore that creek. So what we're doing is building a conveyance system to collect the spring flow and the neighborhood runoff and treat it through a subsurface wetland before it discharges as recharge to that Arboretum Creek. So that's in the process of design. We're looking for funding. If anybody's got construction funding, we'll talk. But it's really cool because it's a community-driven project. And we're integrating stormwater within it and trying to be very context sensitive to the uses and the history of the Arboretum. And I think I'm out of time, but we have a couple minutes for questions. I went slow enough to use up most of the space. But again, I would like to say, give a lot of credit to Christian for stepping in, help us out, and to Matt for putting a lot of effort into his slides. Go find Matt. He's got some really great perspectives as well.
So we do just have a minute or two. So you guys know the drill. The lunch line is a little long. So if you are really hungry, go for it. But if you're like me and you like to wait until the lunch line ends, because this is too good of a conversation, we have some time for questions. So I can be the runner for questions if anybody has some. Hold up your hand and I'll just bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Just two quick questions. In one of the examples, you showed the ponds during the drier months, and I'm wondering about, I think that was in Atlanta, how do they mitigate for additional mosquito habitat? And then my other question is, in the LA example, do you know how their Parks Department decided to take on the stormwater of a different city department, namely their transportation department? Because I know that's been an issue in some of our areas locally. Thanks.
Is this working? Okay. As for Atlanta, I don't know their mosquito abatement program, but I can certainly get back to you on that one. But I mean, it's a concern for sure, but there's open water in lots of locations. So I don't know if they're doing any sort of dosing or anything along those lines, but I hope not. But I don't know on that one. And similarly with the LA, in some areas, what they're doing is bringing funding to it, right? So parks, I think in that case, they needed new fields anyway. So this gave them an opportunity to rebuild those fields and, renew that infrastructure. And again, the key is that you're not competing with community needs, right? Community uses. So really understanding what those needs are. And again, they needed playfields. Playfields are at a premium probably everywhere, right? And it's an important piece of that. So in that case, they came up with that design that says, well, we'll rebuild your fields. And actually by putting infiltration underneath that, you're actually improving the drainage of those fields as well. So I think that was really key to that aspect, is not impacting their uses or even enhancing them, and then giving them renewed infrastructure.
All right. Just heard word that lunch is delayed by 10 minutes, so you don't have to feel bad about staying and having a great convo. And I will hand the mic.
Yeah, I don't know if this was covered when I was looking at lunch, but one thing that I think about, I heard somebody say about mosquitoes, but when you get the 25-year, the 100-year flood in these parks, and then what happens when it recedes? Because stormwater carries a lot of garbage and just ick. And I'm just wondering if anybody has had experience with what happens after these beautiful designs, and how do you keep public health safe, you know, after the water recedes, in time to clean up all the stuff that the water carries.
I have answers that, but I mean, to some extent. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, it's really being intentional about that space, right? So you're letting folks know this is what that function is going to be. It's going to flood. It may take a little while to recede. The other thing is, like, for those areas that you're gonna invite the community back to very quickly, is you do have the drainage system that restores it back to its footprint that it was in before. I've also seen trash kind of screens put upstream in some of these facilities, so that, again, most of the trash that's washing into these spaces is not carrying in. And then there's also just SOPs around the maintenance crews to come back and understand that that's something they need to do. It's something that's programmed in, but it's a 25-year event kind of thing, so. Yeah. I think we've seen a number of different studies that it depends on what pollutant you're talking about. I mean, I know we did a little paper study for Seattle years ago for, like, what is the accumulation of pollutants, and it took quite a bit. I think, Shanta, you were part of that too. It took quite a bit of stormwater to get to levels that were toxic. And it's a matter of that, do the math, be transparent about it. I mean, I don't want to hide that issue away, but it's really understanding what is that impact and how long it will be there for. I'm not sure I've heard any evidence that shows that that's been a concern in terms of the water quality after an event, after it's receded. But I know it's a question people would ask. So maybe it's a data gap that we have, or I just have in my own head about exactly how that's addressed. But, you know, many cases, you know, things like the fecal coliform, that's coming from other sources than just simply the stormwater, right? So like grassy amphitheater that's next to that, it's probably got fecal coliform in it already from all the birds and other uses that are happening in those areas. And so I don't know if stormwater is necessarily the full culprit behind some of those issues, but it's a good question.
All right, let's give it up for Dustin and Christian.
Maybe